Okay, so today we're going to talk about the second part of the Avian Anatomy chapter. And again, most of the material from this stuff comes from the Manual of Ornithology, not from the textbook. You must read the textbook and associate the diagrams from this lecture with the information from the textbook and the diagrams that are within the textbook, which sometimes help to highlight some different things that the textbook's talking about, and that may help expand on some of the ideas that I'm talking about. So you really need to dig into the textbook as well as listen to these lectures. Okay. So we talked about, I think, what did we talk about? Skeletal, muscular, and digestive systems last time. So we're going to talk about uh, really all the rest of the systems today. And most of them we don't have a lot to talk about, but a few of them we have to talk for a bit. We'll start with the circulatory system, which of course is primarily um, the system that pumps blood throughout your body to deliver oxygen to all your cells and uh, move substances throughout your body, and or the bird's body in this case. Um, so the circulatory system in birds is not that different from um, the circulatory system that you or I have. There are differences. A couple of those differences are um, things like the the way the aorta leaves the heart. It leaves the heart and to the right instead of the left. That's an example of a difference in the avian versus human circulatory system. Um, the heart rate is quite different. And it's different in different birds, and so that's why this picture of a hummingbird is here. So a hummingbird has to fuel hovering flight, which is an incredibly energetic uh, or energy expensive activity. And it does that because to fuel its needs for every single day of its life, it has to eat almost its own body weight in nectar. And so to do that, it has to hover at flowers. And so it requires a tremendously powerful circulatory system. And that circulatory system has evolved to have an active heart rate, or number of beats per minute of the heart, of 1300. So 1300 beats per minute during activity. Now, it is a lot less at rest, but it's still much higher than what it would be in, well, really any other bird. So at rest, it's about 500. In comparison, small songbird heartbeats are somewhere around between 350 to almost 500 beats per minute at the high end. And if you compare that to something like an ostrich, well, an ostrich's resting heart rate's only 40 BPM. So there is definitely a relationship between size and heart rate, and also between the needs of the species and heart rate. Um, and if you want to compare that to a human heart rate is around 80 BPM in comparison. So, like I said, the heart is the the aortic arch leaves the heart on the right and arches to the right in birds, and in humans it leaves and arches to the left. It's one of the differences. The human aortic arch is also a bit more pronounced looking as it leaves the heart than it is in birds. In other words, it's a stronger arch. But other than that, it's basically the same. If you open up a bird, so if you dissect a bird, one thing you'll notice when you open the bird up is its heart takes up a tremendous amount of space in the body cavity. And the avian heart is basically about 40% larger than a mammal heart for a similarly sized mammal, and is much more efficient. It pumps more blood for every beat. And this, of course, is all primarily an adaptation to fuel the energetic costs of flight. Here we have a diagram of the avian heart. The avian heart is broken into two main regions, pulmonary And somatic, this is identical to our heart. So if you already are familiar with a human heart, this is all pretty well the same. You have the caval veins or caval veins coming in from the body, pumping deoxygenated blood into the heart. That blood enters one of the first of the 4 chambers of the avian heart. So they have 4 chambers in their heart, just exactly the same as we do, and they are all fully separated from each other, just the same as ours. This is in contrast to more primitive hearts, such as 3-chambered hearts that are much less efficient hearts. So this deoxygenated blood comes into the atrium. A valve called the tricuspid valve opens and lets that blood be pumped down into this ventricle. And from the ventricle, that deoxygenated blood is pumped out these pulmonary arteries to the lungs. So this is the pulmonary side of the heart, the side that delivers deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And so the pulmonary arteries carry the blood to the lungs, where of course the blood becomes oxygenated and is pumped back to the heart, now carrying oxygen right here in these pulmonary veins. And this oxygenated blood enters the left atrium, which then is pumped into the left ventricle and out the aorta. And where's it going? Well, now it's going carrying oxygen to all the rest of the body. It's going to deliver that oxygen throughout the body. And so this is the somatic component of the heart, this left side. This goes to the body, so it's somatic, and this goes to the lungs, so it's pulmonary. This is the same way your heart works. The rest of the cardiovascular system, we're not going to look at diagrams of all the major arteries and veins. That goes beyond what I think we can do in an online type class. If we were in person and we're doing dissections and we could take a look at some of these various arteries and veins, we would do that. But looking at all those things just diagrammatically is not a great way to learn the more fine parts of the anatomy. So we will skip that. But that's how the circulatory system works. Not that different from ours. The respiratory system. The respiratory system, unlike the circulatory system, which was fairly similar to ours, the respiratory system is very, very different from ours. It's completely different. It's pretty amazing how different it is. So the respiratory system, of course, for bringing oxygen in to be picked up by the bloodstream, starts at the mouth and the nares of the bird, where breathing takes place. And so you'll see in different birds the nares in usually about the same position, though usually at the base of the beak. The kiwi, like this is a little spotted kiwi, the kiwi is unique in having nares way out toward the tip of the beak, and the kiwis have a very strong sense of smell as they hunt around, and that sticks that really sensitive sensor, right, the scent sensor, out front to pick up smells. But most birds do not have nares out toward the tips of the beak. So like this peregrine falcon and this pigeon, they both have their nares in sort of what we might call the normal place to find them, toward the base of the bill. The nares of a rock pigeon, you will see, are covered with a sort of flap, and that flap is called an operculum, and it just covers a part of the nares to help keep stuff from getting in them. Inside of the nares. And then a lot of birds, like this peregrine falcon, will have this fleshy covering that comes out over the nares that will usually have some color, like this yellow. This is called the cere, and that is a sexually selective character. Some birds, particularly seabirds, are what we call tube-nosed birds. And so this is a gray-backed storm petrel. And you see it looks like it has a little notch on its nose. It's the tube of the nares. The nares sort of forms a tube. And this has to do with something that is unique to seabirds. Seabirds have to deal with consuming a lot of salt water. Sometimes the only water that they can even get to is salt water. If you drink salt water, it will kill you. If you are in the middle of the ocean and you're dying of dehydration, the worst thing you could possibly do is drink seawater. It will actually dehydrate you faster because the ion concentration in the seawater is so high. Hopefully none of you ever have to put that knowledge to application. But for birds, they don't really have much of a choice. If you're a seabird and you're out on the sea, you've instead evolved a way to deal with that, and you have a salt gland. So all birds have this gland, sort of kind of close to up in the front of the head toward the base of the beak. And in seabirds, this is an active gland that processes salt. And so what it does is it concentrates salt and then exudes it out the nostril. And so in some of these birds, the nostril takes on a strongly tube-shaped structure, and that's why they're called tube noses. And things like petrels have that. Other seabirds, like albatrosses and gulls, some of them will have slightly tube-shaped nares, but not all of them do. But they all have to deal with salt, and they do that with the salt gland. So the nares in the mouth is where air is going to come in and out. That part's not so different from us. And the air is going to come through trachea. And it doesn't go right away to the lungs. And we're going to take a look at the path it takes. But if we look at the anatomy here real quick, we have trachea, we have a syrinx, we have the bronchi, and then we have lungs. The lungs are completely different from our lungs. Our lungs are they're flexible. They can be compressed and inflated, right? So they have a pumping sort of motion to them. Bird lungs don't do that. Bird lungs are sort of rigid structures. And so there's no diaphragm pushing on them or anything like that. It doesn't need to exist because the lungs don't pump. Instead, birds have an intricate series of air sacs throughout their body, and this diagram shows the major air sacs. You've got the cervical, I'll just point at them here, the cervical, interclavicular, the anterior thoracic, posterior thoracic, and abdominal air sacs. So those are some of the most significant air sacs. And you've got these, as you see, they're laid out throughout the entire body cavity. These air sacs are inflatable. They can fill up and pump air. They're like very transparent balloons, essentially, inside of the bird's body. So let's take a look at how the air sacs and the lungs work together to produce airflow. So first I want you to think about how you breathe. When you breathe in and breathe out, you have what's called tidal flow. You breathe in, a nice oxygen-rich breath. Your lungs, there's an exchange of CO2 and oxygen, right? And then you breathe out CO2. So your lungs always have a little bit of a mixture of CO2 and oxygen in them, meaning that your breaths aren't perfectly efficient. And that's the nature of that's this tidal flow breathing. Birds do not have tidal flow breathing. They have one-way respiration. It's one of the most fascinating evolutionary tricks that birds have come up with to fuel the cost of flight. And a single breath takes 2 inhalations and exhalations to fully pass through a bird's body. In the first inhalation, the um, the air from the first breath comes into primarily the posterior air sacs. The posterior air sacs, and that's what you see in this picture here. That's the first inhalation. In the first exhalation, that air is pushed up into the lungs. Pushed up into the lungs. In the second inhalation, new air is brought in. That's the blue here. New air is brought in to the posterior air sacs, and the air that is in the lungs gets pushed forward out of the lungs and into the anterior air sacs. And in the last exhalation, the air that was breathed in this first inhalation is finally pushed completely out, and of course the inhalation from inhalation 2 starts. It moves along right in the same exact pattern, and so you have this constant one-way flow. It's a one-way flow of air through the respiratory system. This is very, very efficient. There is no mixing of CO2 and oxygen. And so it's kind of a very important aspect of avian biology. Tidal versus one-way airflow. Now, these air sacs have some really cool implications. And actually, I could have talked about this bird in terms of nares as well when I started this little section. And so I can briefly tell you about it. So this is a northern gannet, and it's one of the coolest birds on the planet. They fly up over the sea, sometimes many, it could be hundreds of them, and they shoot down to the water like rockets. They literally, like missiles, they fly down into the water really, really fast. They penetrate the water, they dive really deep, and then they swim, actually, and catch fish. That's how they hunt. So these guys are, for one, their bodies are very streamlined, and so that when they actually hit the water, there are some estimates that the impacts aren't as severe as you might expect, just because they're so, basically the force of impact isn't that strong. But they're still hitting the water really, really fast. And so a couple things, when you're hitting the water really fast, you've got to deal with those impact forces. And then for two, when you're swimming around underwater, you have to deal with your nares being open. You will notice on this bird that the nares are not visible. You cannot see the nares in that picture. And if you can, you're doing a better job than I can. But there's a reason for that. You shouldn't be able to, because there's actually a little flap at the base of the bill that covers the nares, and that little flap is right here. Do you see how there's like a jointed spot on the bill here at the base, and that runs kind of almost under the eye? That little flap covers the nares, and whenever the bird goes underwater, the pressure of the water pushes the flap closed, sealing the nares off from the water. So that's how it deals with not getting water into its respiratory system. But what about the impact? Well, the impact, one, has to do with being very sleek and being able to penetrate the water in a very aerodynamic and hydrodynamic way to reduce impact forces. But the other thing that this bird does is it has airbags. It has built-in airbags. Its air sacs extend into a subcutaneous layer, and they will be inflated so that when the bird hits the water, they cushion the blow. Now, I will tell you, there's some research that suggests that these guys are so good at hitting the water in this very aerodynamic way that the impact forces are very low, and these are probably not airbags. There are some arguments against this hypothesis. And so one of the, I'll show you what these airbags look like, the picture on the right here. One of the the hypotheses for why they still might have these is that they're left over from an evolutionary time, an ancestor that wasn't so aerodynamic when it was doing the same sort of feeding behavior and needed that extra cushioning. Um, Basically, the jury's out, but the general consensus right now is still that these are behaving as airbags. And so, on this picture on the right, again, you're seeing what you're seeing is actually from the right side of the bird's body. The head's up here. This is the actually, I guess that's the left side. This is the pectoral muscle. These are the lateral and median wall of the air sac. And what you're seeing is all this thin, sort of translucent tissue is the air sac and the chambers of the air sac. The air sac is the subcutaneous air sac, I should say, is kind of chambered off. And so these can be inflated right underneath the skin and create a cushion. It's sort of like having bubble wrap under your skin. This picture on the left just shows, this is from the same paper, which is this anatomical study of the northern gannet. It's showing something really, really cool here. First, this red filled space. This is the clavicular air sac. And what you see is where this A in parentheses is here, it's going up and it's reaching the humerus. And you can't see what it's doing, but it's actually penetrating the humerus. Remember that birds have hollow bones, or at least some hollow bones, where the air sacs have diverticula, and that's what this is. This is a diverticulum that is reaching up and penetrating into the airspace that's left in the bone. So this is showing that happening, which is a really cool picture for that reason. Another thing to note is that clavicular air sac is, and you can't see it here because of the way this bird's been dissected, but it's positioned between the clavicle bones, right? It's in the wishbone, or the furcula of the bird. And so when the bird flaps in flight and that wishbone squeezes, it's thought that actually pumps on the intraclavicular air sac, possibly helping to force air through the system of air sacs in the lungs. So it's a pretty interesting system. Essentially, that intraclavicular air sac, along with those bones, acts like a billows, if you know what a billows is. Billows is an air pumping mechanism. So that's the respiratory system. The urogenital system. So why urogenital? Well, it's a fusion of both the reproductive systems and the kidneys. So let's talk about the kidneys real quick. So here you can see that there are these 3 lobes on each side. We're looking into the bird through its stomach. So we're looking ventrally. So these are dorsal. They're located toward the back of the bird. And these are the kidneys. And the kidneys, what they do is, they control fluid and ion levels in the body, and primarily they remove nitrogenous wastes from the bloodstream. Right? They remove nitrogenous waste from the bloodstream, and in you make urea. Right? In people, we make urea, and it's carried in a liquid form. And it's held in a bladder until we have to pee, and then we go to the bathroom. We get rid of our liquid nitrogenous waste. Birds don't do that, though. They carry a solid form of nitrogenous waste called uric acid, and that uric acid is transported to the cloaca through the ureters, which you can see on this diagram right here. The ureters. And then that uric acid, which is that white sort of powdery stuff in the uh, in the excrement of a bird is it mixes with the feces. So you've got feces and the uric acid all sort of mixed together. That uric acid is actually an important evolutionary uh, thing for birds. It's significant because by not having a bladder, this does something very beneficial for a bird. If you don't have a bladder, you don't have to carry a big sack of water around with you. And when you're flying, that's a lot of extra weight to have to deal with. Birds don't have to worry about carrying all that extra weight. So this is very beneficial for them to be able to get rid of their waste in this solid product. It also means they get to retain more water because we have to use a lot of water in our bodies to flush nitrogenous wastes. They don't have to use water, nearly the same amount of water, for that same process. So it's a weight reduction and water conservation mechanism. Okay, now let's look at some reproductive systems. We'll look at the male and female and talk about those. Here we can see the male reproductive system, and you see that it's mirrored. The male has two testes that produce sperm, of course, and sperm in most birds are fairly simple, like a long head with a filament. In the um, passerines, they've got a long screw-like tail, but otherwise the sperm are pretty well the same across birds. Um, and of course, their function is to unite with an egg cell and an ovum and produce a baby, to make a zygote. So that's all pretty intuitive. But what you see here in this picture is interesting. You see these paired testes, and one's small and one's big. And one might look at that and go, why is that? Well, in the breeding season, the testes swell up when the male is in breeding condition. And sperm are produced and they are pumped down the vas deferens to the seminal vesicle where they are held until a reproductive event occurs. So they're held really right outside the cloaca. This one's small because this is representing the same system in a non-breeding condition. The testes shrink dramatically in non-breeding condition, and as does actually the vas deferens and the seminal vesicle, and you can see all of that in this picture. It's just everything's small and shriveled and atrophied. But every year in the breeding season, it will go back to this condition. So why is that? Well, it's a weight-saving thing. If birds breed over a fairly narrow window of the year. Some birds might be breeding for a quarter of the whole year, for example. The rest of the time, carrying swollen testicles around testes, I should say, swollen testes around, that's a costly thing. And you're not using them. So they shrivel up because you're not going to be using them anyways. Yeah, and so that's what happens. It's a really cool seasonal way of reducing weight. If we look at the pictures here, we can see a couple other interesting aspects of the male reproductive system. At the top, you see what is called a cloacal protuberance. If that's not clear from the picture, that's this fleshy outgrowth right here. So normally a cloaca in the non-breeding condition or in the breeding condition in females is not it's not swollen. It looks like a little hole that might have be slightly raised from the surface of the rest of the body, but it's not swollen. In breeding condition, the male cloaca swells into what's called a cloacal protuberance, and it will use that cloacal protuberance. It will jam it up into, or up, it's not really very into, but more like against the female's cloaca and ejaculate. And that's how they have sex. It's a really unceremonious sort of production. So that's what happens in the very vast majority of birds. You have a cloacal protuberance in a few birds. So in ducks, ostriches, rheas, tinamous, and geese. They have an actual, or very close to what would be considered an actual penis. It doesn't work exactly the same way you might think of if you compare it to a human penis. It doesn't, the sperm is not carried through the penis on a bird, it's carried along the outside surface. The sperm has to move along the outside surface of the penis. So that's a little bit different. But in general, it's doing the same thing. It's a elongate fleshy structure that enters the female to uh, to reproduce. And so this lake duck is an extreme example of that, where you can see in ducks, this is a very long corkscrew-like structure. It's not always as long as it is in this lake duck. Uh, it's just a particularly striking example. But if you, not that I'm suggesting you should Google this, but if you Google duck penis, you're going to see pictures like this that show these different corkscrew-like phalluses. Um, the there's some really interesting stuff with duck evolution and how females have evolved corkscrew-shaped vaginas in response to male corkscrew-shaped penises, and they keep getting longer and longer. And the males are all. I don't really want to go a lot into duck reproduction because it's a rather aggressive and gross thing. They have a sort of let's just say very aggressive approach to reproduction. Um, but in general, there's this really interesting arms race between males to have longer and longer penises, these corkscrew penises that can go into these long corkscrew vaginas to be the ultimate sexually um, dominant individual. We'll just leave it at that. If you're really curious about it, I do strongly recommend doing a little bit of reading about the evolution of duck reproduction. It's fascinating. Now, other birds that show an actual external penis, like things like an ostrich, they don't look like this. They're not these long corkscrews. So I don't really know how to describe an ostrich's penis to you. You can Google ostrich penis. There are pictures all over the internet of them. Um, but it's still, I mean, it's a fleshy protuberance that comes out of the cloaca, is what it is. So that's male reproductive system. Female's reproductive system is far less maybe striking externally, but far more interesting internally. So basically all female birds have one functional ovary, and it is the left ovary. This is, of course, it's a weight-saving thing, where you only ever have one ovary doing anything. But unlike the male, which turns one, a testy on and a testy off back and forth, or I'm sorry, turns the testes on or off seasonally. In the female reproductive system, it's not like a on or off sort of thing. It's that one oviduct is just off all the time. It's permanently off. It's not even developed. It's what we call vestigial. It's a trait that is an evolutionary remnant, something from the past that no longer. It just has a little trace left behind, and so that's what you see here. This vestigial right oviduct. This thing will never. There would never be an egg laid that moved through that oviduct because it's just this fleshy little vestigial remnant. On the right side, though, you have your. I'm sorry, on the left side, this is the right oviduct. On the left side, though, you have your functioning oviduct and ovary, and so you see the ovary up here. You've got these. It looks like maybe beads or something. Those beads are follicles. The inside of them have the oocyte, which will become the mature ovum. That is the cell that needs to fuse with a sperm to make a zygote. Now if we go and look over here on the right, what we can see is the process as an ovum is released into the oviduct, the process that sort of happens to create an egg. And so here you see there's this infundibulum, which is this sort of kind of cone-shaped open structure that reaches up and sits underneath of the ovary. And that's what, when a mature ovum is being released, it's going to enter through that infundibulum. And as that moves through there, it's going to be fertilized. It's going to be fertilized by a sperm, and we'll talk about how that happens because it's pretty interesting. But then the first thing that has to be created as we start to develop a full egg is the albumin. And the albumin is it's the clear stuff when you crack an egg that you see surrounding the egg, or the egg yolk, is what you call egg whites. So that is the first thing that is produced. That happens in the magnum area. And then you move down into the isthmus region. And that isthmus region is where the membranes, not the hard shell, but the shell membranes are created that go around all that albumin in the yolk and kind of package it into this egg shape that you think of when you think of an egg. And then from there, you move into the uterus region of the oviduct, and this is where the actual egg shell, the hard shell, is produced. And the amount of time that the egg is in that region, as well as how it moves around inside the uterus, will affect the ultimate patterning of the egg. And then finally, of course, you get to the vagina, which holds the egg until it will be laid through the cloaca. Now, fertilization is kind of interesting. So, during a reproductive event, the female might not be at that exact moment in time ovulating. Right? There's a narrow window of time where the female's ovulating, which means a narrow window of time in which the ovum is in the infundibulum and able to be fertilized. So, a male might not reproduce with a female at that exact point. As a matter of fact, it's fairly unlikely that a male will be so lucky as to engage in a reproductive event right at that exact point. So what has to happen is the sperm, they have to wait around for the appropriate time to fertilize an ovum. And so what they do is inside of the oviduct, there are these sperm storage tubules, and that's what you see in this picture on the left. It's from paper that's cited at the beginning of this PowerPoint. And you can see the sperm sitting inside of a tubule in this picture. And they have to sit and wait until certain chemical signals, which may include things like the pH of the oviduct, which will change during ovulation. But certain chemical signals will come about, and they'll go, oh, well, it's time to start working our way up to the infundibulum. And there's at least one paper that suggests that these sperm storage tubules are found around the uterovaginal junction. So that would be the point at which the vagina and uterus meet up. That's where they'll be found. So they have to hang out, and this can take days where the sperm are just waiting for their opportunity. Okay. The endocrine system. We only have one slide for the endocrine system. We're just going to go over some of these different glands that control all sorts of functions of the body. So the endocrine system makes hormones, which are chemical signals that go throughout your body to regulate all sorts of functions inside the body. So let's take a look at these. So the pineal gland. The pineal gland makes melatonin. utilizes melatonin as a way to regulate circadian rhythm. That is, thinking about night-day cycles. When do I need to go to sleep? Oh, it's night out. Or when do I need to wake up? Well, the light's coming out. So it's control circadian rhythm. The pituitary gland is very interesting. The pituitary gland makes several different hormones that are master control switches for other glands in the body. So it makes TSH that controls the thyroid, it makes ACTH that controls the adrenals, and FSH, LH, and prolactin that control gonad function, all that stuff. In addition, it makes antidiuretic hormone that conserves, that controls conservation of water, I should say, through the kidney, and makes oxytocin to stimulate uterine contractions during egg laying. So it does all these different things. It's a lot of stuff. But what you can really just ultimately think of the pituitary gland as the master switch that controls most of the other glands of the endocrine system. And the thyroid and parathyroid make thyroxine and parathormone, respectively. So thyroxine is a part of the regulation, or helps control the regulation of growth and development, which includes molting, the molting process, and parathormone regulates phosphorus and calcium levels in the bloodstream, which is really, really important in egg-laying females. In particular, those calcium levels are a big deal. So the adrenals. So the adrenals make a bunch of different hormones, but they control mineral levels, blood sugar levels, and what you probably think of when you think of adrenal glands. And what we typically think of is they control sexual hormones. The thymus and the bursa of Fabricius. So these two glands both kind of do the same thing. They both regulate cell production and cell behavior within the immune system. So they sort of regulate the immune system. But in particular, the bursa fabricius, as a bird ages, atrophies completely and goes away. So you only see the bursa fabricius in really young birds, whereas the thymus, remains. And so, these are the major glands of the endocrine system and their functions, and that's all we're really going to say about the endocrine system. And the nervous system. So we're not going to talk a lot about the nervous system. I'm going to very briefly talk about the brain structure and avian intelligence, but in a very rudimentary way. And then your discussion post question comes from the nervous system stuff. So here you have a diagram of a typical avian brain structure. You have an olfactory lobe at the front end, right? So this should make sense because the beak is up there at the top. And so olfaction, of course, is your sense of smell. So this is associated with integrating information from the nares related to smell that can be processed in the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the part of the brain that processes higher level information, and it creates voluntary action of the body. The cerebellum is responsible for muscular coordination, balance, and proprioception. It is very, very large in birds, as it takes up a relatively large proportion of the brain, which should make a lot of sense given that birds have to fly and must have strong sense of proprioception, balance, and muscular coordination to do that. The optic lobes and the auricle are associated with vision and hearing. And the medulla oblongata is primarily concerned with various involuntary functions. These are things like breathing, right? You don't have to think about breathing to breathe. Neither do birds. As a matter of fact, if you sit and think about your breathing, you start to have trouble breathing. It's a weird thing. Like you were never supposed to be thinking about how to breathe. You just do it. And so these are the different major regions of the brain. Now, in the cerebrum is interesting because in mammals, the cerebrum has a lot of what's called cerebral cortex, which is this complicated, folded type of tissue that's responsible for generating thought, memory, emotion, language, things like that. It does high level processing. It's what makes us intelligent. It's what contributes to all of our ability to cognate. In birds, uh, there is a cerebral cortex. It is just relatively thin and it sits on the outer surface of the cerebrum. And then below that, though, is a tremendous amount of what's called corpus striatum. Corpus striatum is strong, is a kind of, it still allows for learning to occur. It's very good at reward-based learning. So if I get a good thing out of doing this, I'll do it again. This is one of the reasons that birds are so very trainable. And this corpus striatum is strongly associated with spatial intelligence, which makes sense. If you are flying all over the place, you probably need to have a high spatial intelligence, and also auditory processing, which makes sense if you're one of the very many species that vocalizes in some way, and that vocalization is important, whether it be reproductively or otherwise. So this corpus striatum is very important to birds, but it does generate a lot of stereotypical behaviors because these are sort of the instinctual behaviors that are learned through reward or reinforced through a reward-based system. Reward could be, I got food doing this behavior, so I will continue to do this behavior. But they have very relatively less of cerebral cortex. Humans and mammals in general have more cerebral cortex, quite a lot more cerebral cortex. In some of the most intelligent species, and I think virtually everyone, even if you're not into birds, knows that these include like corvids, like ravens, as a good example. They actually have more cerebral cortex. They have quite a bit of cerebral cortex. It's a thicker layer. This is probably one of the reasons that they are are considered more intelligent birds. But even fairly simple birds are capable of learning. Raptors are really quite intelligent. They're problem solving. You can see an intelligent, this is going to sound cheesy and not very scientific, you can see an intelligence in their eyes when you look at them. They have a fairly, I think, strong intelligence. Certainly, they're not going to sit down and write a philosophy book or solve a physics problem. But do not underestimate the intelligence of birds. I think that's really what I'm trying to say. They are smarter than you may initially give them credit for. We use words like bird-brained to describe intelligence in a negative light. So we might call someone bird-brained if we're trying to call them stupid, which is not a nice thing to do. Don't do that. But we shouldn't do it not only because it's mean to the person, but because it really is an inaccurate way of describing actual avian intelligence. Birds are not stupid. So that's a little bit about avian intelligence. I strongly recommend. There's so many cool examples of people that have trained birds to do amazing things, and also birds that have, all on their own, particularly corvids, learned to solve intricate puzzles and things. Very, very cool stuff and worth investigating. Okay, let's get to the discussion question. So the discussion question this week, when you get in the book and you get to the section on the nervous system, it talks about the brain some. I don't think it talks about avian intelligence at all, if I remember correctly, which is kind of strange, but it covers all of the senses. It covers taste and smell and vision and how those different senses work anatomically. Your discussion post this week is you pick a bird that you want to learn more about. And you have to try to think about some situation that bird might find itself in during the day. Or if it's an owl, it could be during the night. But some situation the bird might find itself in. Write a synopsis of that. Write an outline or sort of a description of what this event is that this bird is experiencing. And so some examples could be maybe the bird is hunting its prey, or maybe it's hunting for berries. Maybe the bird is sitting on a perch and it witnesses a hunter walking through the forest and firing a gun. That could be an example. Maybe the bird is in a territorial dispute with a conspecific. Anything like that. And then describe how the bird processes or perceives its world through all of its senses. So to do that, you need to describe the event and then the anatomical structures that are involved in processing the different aspects of the event. So, and I give an example here of a red-tailed hawk hunting a gray squirrel. You would need to discuss how the hawk heard its prey, how it spotted it, so auditory information, visual information. How do those things work anatomically? How does an eye work? How does the ear work? This may require you to do a little bit of research, and that's okay. How tactile sensation might be transmitted as the bird grasps its prey. What tastes and smells might be involved as the animal's ripped apart as the hawk is eating it, etc. You're describing both in a real sense what's going on with the bird as it's going through this event, how it's perceiving the event, and then literally what its body physically does, chemically does, electrically does, to take that information and integrate it in its brain. So the anatomical aspect. And then for the response, you just need to take your example and compare it with other people's examples to the best of your ability. I'm hoping that people have enough of a diverse array of species and experiences that you can make some interesting comparisons. If every single one of you picks a pigeon looking for a seed, it will be a pretty boring discussion. But if you get some of you are picking, I don't know, something like nighthawks, some of you are picking eagles, some of you are picking toucans, we can very easily get a good diversity of species, and it could make for an interesting comparison of these species and how they experience their world and what sort of experiences they're having. Ultimately, the experience should be grounded in the real natural history of the species you select. Okay, I think that's a good enough explanation of your discussion post. So I have, and if you have any questions, of course, as always, please reach out to me.